Many say that Lamborghini got their start with the 350 GT or the Miura, depending on who you ask. But I would argue that both of those people are wrong, because the Lamborghini that we know and love today really got their start with what is objectively one of the worst cars ever made, and yet also one of the best, the Countach. In 1966, Lamborghini invented the modern supercar with the Miura. Mid-engined, rear-wheel drive, big old V12. It was, and still is, a legend that ranks among the most revered performance cars of all time. I've seen two of them. They're gorgeous, and they're incredibly significant in automotive history. So it may have only sold 764 units, but it changed cars forever and made Lamborghini an international name. So they had to follow it up with another flagship V12. You can't just rest on your laurels. So the job was tasked to Palio Stanzani was tasked to oversee the project called LP112. Now, there were some things to improve on for the Miura, despite the legendary status. Even the SV had its fair share of issues, so the LP112 was focused on increasing high-speed stability, increasing cooling for the engine, and improving the weight distribution. After 3 years of development, it was unveiled in 1974. And like many names, especially in Italy, it had a very bizarre story behind it. Apparently, a local hand helping with the maintenance only spoke the local Italian dialect, Piedemonte, and in that dialect, both goodness and plague as words are pronounced, Countach. I don't know which one is right, because in English, it is written Countach to a native English speaker. And since the designers and developers heard that word so much, they don't really know what they were saying it as. They couldn't tell if it was plague and the vehicle was awful, or goodness. I want to go with the Lamborghini goodness as the latter, but they heard it so much around the office that they jokingly suggested it as a name to Ferruccio Lamborghini, and he liked it, so they went with it. And as a result, the Lamborghini Countach longitudinal rear position 4-liter was ready. The V12 made 375 horsepower and launched the Countach to over 180 miles an hour, which is kind of incredible given the bodywork. The styling is, well, no other way of putting it, iconic. The wedge styling was pioneered by the Countach. Granted, it didn't invent it. The 1968 Alfa Romeo Carbato concept did it first, but the Countach put it into production first. And that wedge may seem very aerodynamic, but it was actually the exact opposite. Because aerodynamics is not just making the pointiest thing and going in a straight line. There's a lot of very subtle body lines and streamlines that need to be worked out for the airflow going over to create the minimum possible turbulence. The Countach didn't do that. The body lines of the Countach create a whole lot of turbulence, and the drag coefficient is actually worse than most modern minivans. So, not exactly high-tech, and that's just the tip of the iceberg for the Countach's problems. The rear visibility was great, compared to being blind. The clutch was heavier than a barrel of bricks. You sat so low you couldn't see what's directly in front of you. You got an average of 8 mpg, and then there were the doors. This pioneered Lamborghini's Scissor Doors, which are awesome, iconic, and just plain cool. I love them. They also had a tendency to hit the ceiling of any garage you were parked in, and if you rolled over, you were completely trapped. Yeah, it's not like the gull wings of the SLS, where if they had like explosive bolts. No, if you crashed in a Countach and flipped over, your best bet was to try to kick out the windshield, because otherwise you were screwed. Needless to say, the Countach was a very flawed vehicle that you never really want to own, and yet none of that mattered because you just have to look at it and listen to it. It's an incredible car. It's the ultimate bedroom wall poster car, and it cemented Lamborghini as the kings of poster cars for the rest of their career. And that design made it perfect for the silver screen, being featured in everything from The Wolf of Wall Street to Miami Vice to a little film called The Cannonball Run. Now, a keen-eyed viewer might notice that the LP400S used in the film was unique compared to the other 236 400Ss built. And that's because of stringent auto laws. You see, most European cars like Ferraris or Porsches were either not for sale here or significantly slower and or uglier. Lamborghini didn't like either of those options, so they didn't sell it at all. Which means if you wanted a Countach here in the States, you had to go to the gray market. And taking this avenue meant you had to modify your import to meet EPA and crash safety requirements. Now, you can do that with catalytic converters or fancy engine tuning and hideous 5-mile-an-hour crash bumpers. But even the 5-mile-an-hour bumper wasn't enough because the front end, as I said earlier, was so low it couldn't pass pedestrian safety requirements. Something about cutting the legs out and just killing someone if you ran them over. I don't know. It's silly, but the US has these laws. But people still want a Countach. How is Wall Street going to show how rich they are without a Countach? Well, an American design house began offering wings, bolted onto the front of the car, and these front wings magically raised the bumper to acceptable heights. I'm not making that up. The US government actually allowed the front spoiler to be considered a bumper. That's just cool. A lot of people don't like these because it sort of ruins the original styling, and I can understand that with the weird bumpers, but the front wing is awesome. I love it. It perfectly encapsulates the over-the-topness of the Countach and the showmanship associated with owning it. I think it looks great. Do I kind of prefer without the front wing? Yeah, but I certainly don't complain about it. And clearly, people didn't either, because in this Countach's second year, they had sold nearly 400 of them. They were already halfway to the total Miura production. They were only in their second year. But then their biggest change came from an unlikely source that shot those numbers into the stratosphere. The Canadian oil tycoon and F1 team owner Walter Wolf had bought an LP400, the original spec. I thought it was fine, it was good, no problems with it, but he just couldn't leave well enough and he wanted more. So he contacted Lamborghini's chief engineer and wanted a custom version. So they made the Walter Wolf Countach, and consider this more of a prototype for what the Countach would eventually become that we know it so well for. Because the Wolf Countach has pioneered the signature style, the rear tires grew exponentially, the wheel arches were extended to fit them, and the aerodynamics were added, most notably the famous delta rear wing. He actually got 3 Countachs. The third one had driver's seat adjustable 8-caliper brakes and an F1 spec clutch. The engine was also apparently uprated to 450 horsepower and went nearly 200 miles an hour. When the Wolf Specials came out, they drew a lot of attention, and Lamborghini liked that attention, as you would, so they applied most of that styling to the rest of the Countach lineup. Now, granted, they had to attach the rear wings in the parking lot, and they didn't actually provide any downforce. The only thing the rear wings did, apart from look awesome, is they added drag, so technically they're some of the worst rear wings you could possibly imagine. But it doesn't matter, because the LP500S, as it was called, had a 5-liter V12, hence the 500, from the concept car, making 414 horsepower, but Lamborghini, being Lamborghini, wanted more. And what do you do when you want more? You add a frickin' 0 to it. So they had the 5000 QV. Thanks to a new 4-valve per-cylinder engine and Bosch Jetronic fuel injection, the QV was the most powerful production Countach ever at 450 horsepower. It's a great car. It's one of the most popular of the Countaches. But it wasn't the best Countach, and it wasn't the most popular. You see, for the Lamborghini's 25th anniversary, they entrusted a new designer to make a special edition Countach for the occasion. That designer is Horacio Pagani. Before he founded his own car company, you could sort of see the inklings of what Pagani as a company would become, because the Countach 25th anniversary might just be the best overall Countach. The body style was redone, with air intakes laid out longitudinally instead of transverse to streamline the bodywork and increase airflow. Then it had new Pirelli P0 tires, and the suspension was refined. And like modern Pagani's, the inside was much better, with electronically adjustable seats that were wider. AC was standard, and the windows were electric. Basically, the 25th anniversary had the performance of a 5000 QV, but had an interior that could actually be usable. And yet Pagani still wanted more. He made the Evoluzione prototype in 1987, and I'll be honest, calling this Countach is a bit of a stretch. It shared nothing but the engine, wheels, and the suspension from an Oro Countach. The chassis was completely from scratch with a composite unibody. The engine itself was retuned up to 500 horsepower. The transmission was fitted with a new short-throw shifter and completely new styling that dropped the drag coefficient by 10%. That just goes to show you how awful the Countach's design is aerodynamically. But since it used pioneering aluminum honeycomb, Kevlar, and carbon fiber construction, it also cut the weight down by 900 pounds. This was a beast of a car that never got to production for one reason or another, and it actually led to Pagani leaving Lamborghini because he was not feeling fulfilled there, and that's how Pagani as a company was founded. As for the Evoluzione concept, well, they used it as a test bed for all-wheel drive systems, active suspension, and other technologies before they crash tested it and scrapped it. That's a bit of a sad end to that vehicle. But believe it or not, the Evoluzione was not the craziest concept. It was incredibly innovative and forward-thinking, but it wasn't crazy. The Turbo S, that was crazy. Lamborghini Switzerland commissioned 2 twin-turbo versions of the Countach in 1980, and when they were unveiled in the 1984 Geneva Motor Show, they had a reported 748 horsepower and over 600 foot-pounds of torque. That means it had a 0 to 60 of 3.7 seconds and a top speed of 208. With that drag coefficient, that is 9 miles an hour faster than the Ferrari F40, which came out 3 years later. And it was the first turbocharged Lamborghini ever. And yet nobody knows why they didn't put it in production. They simply forgot about it and made the QV instead. That is the only reason. Only 2 of them are known to exist. They're awesome. I don't know why they weren't made into production. Frankly, nobody else, even at Lamborghini, knows why they weren't put into production, but there you go. I guess we just can't have good things sometimes. And speaking of good things, we almost had the most epic rally car ever. Because famously, Lamborghini did not have a factory racing program for decades, and yet a few racing Countaches managed to get into private hands. The British Lamborghini importer saw it fit to modify a Countach for Group B rallying. Yeah, that Group B rallying. I think we all would have loved to see a mid-engine V12 run up a rally stage. We never did. The closest we ever got was the BMW M1 that competed in a few events in '83, I think. But it never materialized because the Countach did not have enough units made at that point to justify production. So he switched gears and went to Group C instead at Le Mans, and stuck a Countach V12 into the middle of a Group C chassis. And it entered 7 races in the 1986 World Sports Car Championship, and to be honest, it had pace to be a contender, but not the reliability, because it's an Italian V12, which are not normally reliable anyway, and you're asking it to do endurance racing. I don't know what his thought process was. So the project was scrapped before the beginning of the next season. And then we have an even crazier man in the United States who decided to turn a Countach into a salt flat racer. They draped a super sleek aerodynamic body over a Countach chassis, and then fitted the special speedrunning wheels for aerodynamics, and ran it at Bonneville, setting a C-Class modified speed record of 201.793 miles an hour on the salt flats, a record which stood for 10 years. And then that was it. The Countach was replaced by the equally awesome, if not quite as over-the-top, Diablo. And then the V12s moved on all the way to the Murcielago, then to the Aventon, and then to the Aventador, and now to the Cayenne. Which is a perfect segue, actually, because the Countach is back! In 2021, Lamborghini announced they were bringing back the Countach for its 50th birthday, and it would be based off their new flagship V12, the upcoming Cayenne. And it would feature its signature 803 horsepower hybrid V12, and with its all-wheel drive and its supercapacitors, the LPI 800-4 Countach can do 0 to 60 in 2.8 seconds and hit 221 miles an hour. And I'll be blunt, I really, really want to like this car because I think it looks pretty good, it sounds amazing, and it's blisteringly fast. But I can't because it's not a Countach, okay? The Countach, half of its mythos is that it's a bit of a brute. It's a bit of an animal. Driving it is like driving an old-school fighter jet to the edge of space. It's incredibly difficult to drive, it's incredibly unforgiving, it's a bit of a brute, and its styling is very much a sledgehammer compared to Ferrari's scalpels. And the modern Countach limited edition doesn't feel that way. It feels like a much better Aventador. I love the Aventador, but slapping a Countach name on it doesn't feel right. There's no massive rear wings, no crazy vents, and it is no longer the symbol of excess that the Lamborghinis used to be, because back in the 80s, you either had Ferrari, Lamborghini, or Porsche. There was no Bugatti. There was no Pagani. There were none of these limited-run 20-unit cars that are symbols like Bugatti Chirons or Koenigsegg Regeras or anything like that. There's nothing like that in the 80s, so you either had a Ferrari, which is good, or a Lamborghini. And now, the Countach doesn't really feel like it has the same weight as it used to. So, is it a great car? Probably. Does it deserve the Countach name? I'm not so sure.